If you're in exercise, whether it's running, swimming, cycling, or any type of endurance sport, you've probably heard of training zones. They're on treadmills, they're posted in gyms, and they're in health apps. Some common names for training zones include cardio zone, fat burning zone, healthy fit zone, recovery zone, neuromuscular zone. All these zones might have different names on different apps, but they should all represent similar physiological states of exercise. Today, I'm going to explain and break down training zones to show you what each zone should represent physiologically. But before we get started, I want to quickly show you guys how intensity and duration can quickly affect how our body reacts to exercise. Our bodies are always adjusting and readjusting according to internal and external environmental factors and variables. Some examples of this include temperature regulation, sweating to cool down, or shaking to warm up. Another example of this is immune response. So when you start getting sick, your body releases more white blood cells to fight off infections. It's the same thing with hydration. Your kidneys withhold urine and send out thirst signals to encourage drinking. And of course, it's similar with oxygen demand. When your body starts working, it's got a higher demand for oxygen, which means your heart rate and your breathing rate increase to deliver more oxygen to your muscles. To give you a big picture on how this all works, let's start by looking at what happens when we start exercise. When we begin, our muscles send out signals to cue the breakdown of fuels so that they can be powered effectively. I'm not calling our body lazy, but it likes to use the easiest and most accessible fuel sources first. So this means using ATP that's already stored in the muscles. ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate. It's a compound that's the energy currency of our body. Cells trade with it, they take out loans and they repay them back later, and it's basically like a dollar bill. Once our stored ATP has run out, our body has to make more. It does this by using a combination of other pathways to quickly resynthesize more ATP. The first pathway it turns to is the phosphocreatine system. This system breaks down phosphocreatine bonds to release energy, quickly replenishing ATP stores, but it only lasts a couple of seconds. The next system is anaerobic glycolysis. This is the breakdown of sugar without the presence of oxygen. So in anaerobic glycolysis, we're taking a sugar molecule, breaking it down without oxygen, getting the energy from that, and quickly using it to replenish our ATP. The next system that our body turns to is the oxidative system. This is where our body breaks down molecules of fat and sugar using oxygen to produce more ATP per molecule than in the anaerobic area where they were not using oxygen. This system takes a little bit longer to get up and running, and it takes a little bit longer for a particle to go through the whole process and get its energy ripped off of it. So that's why our body first turns to these quick and very easy sources of energy to replenish the muscles with ATP. In a flight or fight scenario, you definitely want to have energy on hand so you can run away from a bear or finish a race in first.
This little table right here shows some of the key differences between the aerobic and anaerobic system. Make sure to note how much more ATP is produced with the aerobic system.
The body is basically always transitioning through these zones. It starts off by using what's available in the muscles and then turns to other systems to help replenish the ATP that's being used by your muscles. And ATP is always being used. It helps your heart contract, helps you get out of bed in the morning. I'll talk a little bit more about this later, but now that you have a basic understanding of how this works, let's talk about training zones. I like to break up training zones into 6 sections: Zone 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, where each zone represents its own metabolic stress on your body. So a Zone 1 ride will never have the same kind of metabolic stress as a Zone 5 or 6 ride. That makes each zone unique and distinguishable from the others.
You're also able to determine zones by looking at lactate and substrate utilization. Substrate utilization is a fancy word for fuel source. This basically means that you can tell what zone you're in by looking at the ratio of carb and fat utilization. As you can see here, as intensity increases, we begin using more carbs to meet the increasing ATP demands of our bodies. Fat is too slow, so we turn to breaking down sugar to quickly supply our muscles with energy. This shift in fuel use also highlights a shift in fiber type. Our body has 2 main types of muscle fibers, fast and slow twitch. Fast twitch fibers are muscle fibers that contract quickly and powerfully but fatigue rapidly. They're used for explosive movements like sprinting or heavy lifting and rely mostly on anaerobic energy. Slow twitch muscle fibers contract more slowly with less force but can sustain activity for longer. They're great for endurance activities like long-distance running or cycling, and primarily use aerobic energy. There's other kinds of type 2 fibers that do a little bit of both, but we'll get into that another time.
I'll start off by giving a brief overview of what each zone means.
Zone 1 training, often called active recovery or simply recovery zone, is a level of intensity that you should be able to easily maintain. This training zone is used to promote recovery. It helps to increase blood flow, act as a mental flush and relaxation, and it's also a good time to work on skills. One of my favorite ways to do recovery days is to just take my mountain bike out, mess around, freshen up on a few skills, keep it easy, keep it light, and keep it fun. The main goal of Zone 1 training is to not add more stress onto your body. If you're doing structured workouts, you may have a Zone 1 training day, and it's best to keep these really light. You just want to get your body moving, get blood flowing, and not add more stress onto your body. At low intensity, like during Zone 1 training, your body needs very little ATP, so your body produces very little ATP. It uses a little bit of fat, a little bit of glucose, and produces a little bit of lactate. Now, as this exercise intensity increases, your body continues to need more and more ATP. So to meet up with the demands, it starts synthesizing more. It continues breaking down more and more fat at an increasing rate up until your body reaches its fat max. Fat max is exactly what it sounds like, the exercise intensity at which your body burns the highest amount of fat. Many people use this point as a reference for determining where their Zone 2 should be, because it typically occurs at the same intensity where the body efficiently uses fat for energy. Training at this intensity not only maximizes fat burning, but also improves your aerobic base, enhances mitochondrial function, and a load of other benefits. Zone 2 is often referred to as the engine building zone, as it lays the foundation for better performance at higher intensities while being sustainable and relatively easy to recover from. Zone 2 training is where people start to get a little bit confused, because it should be an intensity that you're able to maintain, but it shouldn't feel too easy and it shouldn't feel too hard. So it's a little bit blurry on both ends of the spectrum, and I think that's what makes it really hard for some people to really feel comfortable saying that they're riding at their Zone 2. Something I like to do to help people kind of find where that Zone 2 should be at is to ask them to pretend like they're talking on the telephone. And then I ask them if the other person on the line would know that they're exercising or not. So say you're on the trainer and you pick up a phone call, would the person on the other end know that you're riding a bike? Are you able to maintain a conversation, but you have to take brief pauses to take a little breath? So this talking test is one way to determine if you're kind of in the right area. Are you able to maintain a conversation, but would the other person know that you're riding a bike or running or swimming? You know, it's probably hard to talk on a phone in a pool. As intensity increases, our body's unable to meet the demands simply by using fat, so we start switching over to using glucose. And when we start using glucose, we also start recruiting type 2 fibers. I mentioned earlier that type 2 fibers are not as efficient as type 1 because they lack mitochondria, relying more so on glucose as a fuel source. Zone 3 acts as a transition zone. It takes you from where you're using the most fat at the end of Zone 2, all the way until where you're using purely carbohydrates in Zone 4. Zone 3 training, often referred to as tempo, is just above Zone 2, and it's where your body transitions from using fat and glucose to more primarily glucose. And so this is a little bit of a higher exercise intensity. You won't be able to maintain a conversation comfortably, and someone would definitely be annoyed with you if they're on the phone and you're trying to talk to them. Be like a couple words every couple breaths, because you're really trying to maximize the amount of oxygen you're getting in. In Zone 4, there's a almost total drop-off of fat utilization as your body switches to primarily carbohydrate breakdown. Zone 4 is often referred to as the threshold zone. You enter this zone when you need a lot of ATP synthesized really quickly. So to do that, your body breaks down glucose and produces lactate, hence why it's often called your lactate threshold or maximal lactate steady state. You can normally maintain this zone for around 15 to 30 minutes, depending on your training level. As intensity increases or you continue to stay in the lactate threshold zone, your body continues to accumulate lactate. The preferred way of dealing with it is to send it off to nearby slow twitch muscle fibers so it can be broken down in the mitochondria. However, when a lot of lactate is being created because of the breakdown of sugar, sometimes the mitochondria get oversaturated with lactate and they're unable to process it. It's at that point that lactate begins accumulating in your blood. This results in elevated lactate levels in your blood, indicating that your mitochondria are fully saturated and working at their maximum already. So having good mitochondrial density or a lot of mitochondria allows you to keep pushing this limit higher as you're able to deal with more and more lactate before it ends up in your bloodstream. To better illustrate this, let's look at where it's actually taking place. Here we have the muscle, and inside of that we have fascicles. Inside of these fascicles we have groups of muscle fibers. These fibers are made up of both type 1 and type 2 muscle fibers, as we talked about earlier. And it's here that lactate shuttling is taking place. When intensity is high, the type 2 fibers, marked here in white, are creating a lot of lactate. That lactate is being shuttled off to the nearby type 1 fibers, which contain a lot of mitochondria, for more efficient breakdown. When the intensity is too high and the type 1 fibers can't keep up with the breakdown of lactate, lactate begins entering the bloodstream. Next, we'll talk about zone 5. Zone 5 is often referred to as your VO2 max, or maximal aerobic capacity zone. It's where fat is no longer used and a lot of lactate is produced very quickly. Normally, you can only maintain this zone for around 2 to 4 minutes. In this chart, you can see the energy zones moving from faster and more intense energy production on the left to slower and more sustainable long-term energy production to the right. Of course, our body is never just using one energy pathway. It's using a combination of all of these, and this graph just shows which ones are the main contributors and at what time points. You can shift between them based on how hard you push yourself. For example, if you do a zone 5 or VO2 max intensity, your energy will likely be primarily coming from the anaerobic glycolysis pathway. And if you do a zone 6 interval, that energy will likely be coming from the ATP phosphocreatine pathway, because the intensity is so high and you need ATP very quickly. Of course, if you try and maintain this intensity, your performance will eventually drop, because that energy system isn't able to last that long due to its finite resources. That's why you can't sprint a marathon. Understanding energy systems is essential for getting the most out of your training zones. Each zone targets how your body produces energy, from burning fat in zone 2 to using stored ATP for sprints in zone 6. Training in the right zone improves the energy system and muscle fibers you need for your goals, like endurance, speed, or power. Everything in your training, from fat burning to lactate clearance, ties back to these energy systems and how your body creates and uses ATP to keep you moving. Thanks for watching, and please subscribe.